Hi, I'm Jack Schwartz, a psychoanalyst in private practice in Northern New Jersey. I am affiliated with both the New Jersey Institute for Training in Psychoanalysis and the Object Relations Institute located in Manhattan, New York. I'm very pleased to be able to speak today, and my discussion offers some initial clinical impressions. It's built around clinical impressions in response to the COVID-19 virus pandemic and the ideas surrounding what I describe as a sense of dread and the therapeutic actions of interpreting and holding. What is often overlooked is that in psychoanalysis has long stood at the vanguard of the psychic frontline, if you will, of every world calamity, inclusive of war, political upheaval, natural disaster, and of course, in today's circumstance, a serious health crisis in the form of a life-threatening pandemic. Generally, psychoanalytic psychotherapists work in private confines of their consulting rooms, intensely engaged in deep therapeutic conversations with a single patient. Although marital, group, and family work can also be part of it, the primary emphasis is the individual patient, dating back to Freud's day. In many ways, we practice much in the same way that Freud practiced 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. The psychoanalytic psychotherapist influences society from a location of one person at a time, one interaction at a time, and incrementally over time, which is often barely registered in the macro picture, especially in times of national crisis. Despite this, each day and each week and each year, psychoanalytic psychotherapists, often despite their own circumstance, stands at the forefront of facing and holding each of their patients' individual conscious and unconscious conflict that are often accompanied by a sense of fear and dread. In this next section, I'm talking about the therapeutic action in regard to today's dilemma. Psychoanalysis is not a science created from a lofty academia, but built on the intensive, continuous clinical engagement in an effort to find relief for human mental suffering. In the wake of this viral epidemic, the psychoanalytic psychotherapist is especially challenged to address the ongoing crisis through their clinical understanding and acumen. Jeff Seinfeld in 1993 identified the two key clinical actions of psychoanalysis as interpreting and holding, which come very much to play in these days of dealing with this pandemic, as well we'll see in the clinical example. Recently, I've encountered a number of patients begin their session with a catastrophic comment, such as, "Looks like we're all going to die. This is the end of the world. I feel a complete loss of control." Or, "I don't know what is going to happen to me or my family. I have this terrible feeling I will not only be sick, but broke too." All these comments and their various iterations speak to one feeling that I will call a sense of dread. To be certain, we are facing a nearly unprecedented serious life and death reality in this pandemic, only fueled by the short-sighted mismanagement and denial from our government that has put us months behind in testing, funding, treatment, and containment options, only amplifying the sense of anxiety that runs as rampant as the virus itself. The psychoanalytic psychotherapists, like our patients, live in the same world and are subject to the same environmental threats and health concerns. We also must acknowledge psychotherapists also feel their own sense of anxiety and even dread in such a crisis. Yet as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, We have chosen a path of creating intimate, close connections with people over time in the confines of our enclosed consulting rooms. This pandemic sets up an incredible challenge to this paradigm, rupturing the regular flow of contact and connection. The Cambridge Dictionary simply puts dread as a strong feeling of fear or worry. We don't need to be psychoanalysts to recognize how a potentially catastrophic viral outbreak would create such severe worry, both threatening our lives and our livelihood. There is no psychoanalytic writer or theorist, or for that matter, clinician, who has not confronted the issues surrounding feelings of overriding dread in the face of societal catastrophe. It could be postulated dread is one of the fundamental affective experiences that belies nearly all symptoms and reasons for entering therapy in the first place. In psychoanalytic circles, it is common belief that external circumstance merely provides a medium for the therapeutic exchange, and generally external circumstance are used by the patient as both a facilitator of deeper conversation, as well as a resistance to the deeper conversation. And sometimes it happens in both ways. In psychoanalytic terms, we're often thinking about what lies beneath the current emotional situation and distress. This, of course, has implications for our current state of environmental external threat. I want to pull forth a clinical example that maybe captures the spirit of the notion of interpreting and holding that recent occurrence that I had with a patient. So in this example, it's about a very successful woman nearing 70 years old. She had some health issues, and so she's particularly feeling vulnerable. And she expressed deep duress and overwhelm regarding the pandemic, not only for her health and the health of her children, but also for her finances. I had worked with her on and off for many years. And she described in this session, I'm so worried. I worked my whole life, and now I know I now will lose everything. I have no control, she says. I feel helpless. At that moment, she begins to cry in the session. I sat quiet, allowing the emotional truth to emerge without distraction. And after she regrouped, I pointed out this was not the first time she had experienced a loss of control. I should say a terrifying loss of control. She seemed confused, and she said to me, "What do you mean?" I pointed out many instances that she found herself in what seemed to be a severe crisis, or at least she felt that way, and that we successfully worked through it. She seemed relieved to be reminded that she was resilient. I then wondered that out loud, that this loss of control that she emphasized regarding the pandemic somehow mirrored her early life circumstance related to the terroristic, often unpredictable attacks by her abusive mother. This I'll describe as an interpretation. We were talking about holding an interpretation. This would be an interpretation. The patient then experienced a linking moment between her current sense of dread from the virus and her early pre-verbal and middle childhood circumstances. Then, after making the connection between the two, she said, as she sat back, I want to breathe now. This whole situation takes my breath away. I listened to her comment, and then I came to a reframing, suggesting to the patient that perhaps your breath was not actually taken away, but rather you're holding your breath because you live in a world that can be unpredictable and dangerous, like with our current pandemic. I went on, holding one's breath is a natural occurrence in a state of fear, I said. It's another form of interpretation. She liked the reframing, thinking it was less passive to hold one's breath than to have your breath taken away. She then remarked by the close of the session that she felt a sense of relief in knowing that she had endured many critical circumstances, which made her grow, and that she actually is quite resilient. She thanked me for reminding her of this. In this moment, I felt there was a sense of holding between us. That this was a safe place, a safe harbor for her to kind of unravel and then re-ravel, so to speak, to come back together. And I felt a sense of holding. And in the subsequent sessions, her relief continued, as well as she began to make some headway in areas of her life, and using this experience of being held back in quarantine to do some creative things, such as writing and reconnection with people through virtual means. So this ended up to be a creative period for her after she had the initial reaction of being very overwhelmed. The existential threat from this virus, even though it is a collective societal event, is always in the final analysis experienced through the personal lens of one's own existence. The dread that is common in this is an understandably ubiquitous emotional response to such a situation, especially in this early phase, where there's so much unknown, so much uncertainty that we continue to struggle with. Yet the dread we speak of does not arise from this pandemic alone, but also a product and a connection to earlier archaic resonance of a time when we were absolutely dependent on the other for our survival. Simply put, our life was in the hands of a sometimes not good enough other. This theme of environmental failure of provision and protection runs through most of Ronald Fairbairn's work, as well as the writings of pediatrician turned psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Those are the two strongest voices, in my mind, of the British British School of Object Relations. These theorists, clinicians, saw the infant as precariously in a situation ruled by a rather unpredictable and at times unreliable caretakers, who, for a variety of reasons, become not good enough, even destructive, when the infant is in a position of having no defense against such failure. For Winnicott, who was no stranger to cultural calamity as he witnessed a blitzkrieg at his doorstep, labeled the early state of precariousness as annihilation anxiety. I think as you're listening to this, you could see where I'm going. Because essentially, without the necessary provision, the infant would feel a kind of panicked non-existence, or in other words, a sense of dread. Remember, it's not a thought of dread, it's more of a sense of dread, kind of a feeling state. Winnicott wrote, anxiety in these early stages of the parent-infant relationship relates to the threat of annihilation. The holding environment, therefore, has as its main function the reduction to a minimum of impingements to which the infant must react with resultant annihilation of personal being. So clearly, we can see it's a quick jump to interpret that our societal government, the work routine, the therapy relationship representing the holding environment, then with the advent of this environmental calamity representing a significant rupture or impingement of our continuity of being, as Winnicott would say, we would indeed experience the emotional event in the form of a sense of dread. The precursor would be annihilation anxiety. which sets in motion a search for the object to provide comfort. We certainly know that we look to our government, various politicians, we're looking for scientists, we're looking to these people to search for a sense of comfort, an understanding, which kind of equals a form of comfort. The therapeutic relationship, first and foremost, is a supportive experience whereby the individual under threat seeks shelter and a safe port to feel less alone, less overwhelmed. In other words, the holding action, which occurred in the session that I mentioned about that patient. The pandemic can also represent not only a link to earlier memories of dread, but also, as in the above, fear of losing what has been finally gained. So we're thinking about not only that you're having a threat, an existential threat, but the loss of everything that you worked toward. Like the woman mentioned, her loss of her money. She worked all these years for this career, and everything she worked for will be knocked away because of the way the markets are. And there's another example. I mentioned a person who started a session with these words, that we're all going to die. He started the session that way. We're all going to die. His provocative, rather morose comments were typical for this patient, often preoccupied with death. The truth was he was very worried about losing what he had attained. In a way, his comment was a sort of evacuation of the worst case scenario to vent his fear and vulnerability in kind of a sarcastic style, which he admitted later in session, especially the prospect of possibly losing his mother to the illness, to the virus. Now, if we flash back a bit from this patient, it takes us from this moment and the background of this patient in his conscious and unconscious kind of churning. More than 6 years ago, the same fellow was arrested for aggravated assault and at the time was addicted to opioids. Indeed, his world had ended. But his world really ended before that. At age 9, he was a victim of sexual abuse that he long ago repressed and retrieved later in his analysis. He got out of his criminal charges, then went into recovery through NA, has been sober since, and then now is on the verge of getting a promotion at a serious job, and has his own apartment. He's reconciled with his immediate family. He's become engaged. And he says set a date to be married and is looking forward to the notion of fatherhood. Linking to his arduous journey to live a functional life, the last thing he wanted was for all of us to die. The patient acknowledged his sense of guilt and the cruel punishment he deserved for his countless misdeeds when he was an addict. I interpret that perhaps he spoke the worst case as a way he could protect himself from the deeper pain and guilt of actually losing what he's worked so hard to attain, which is a form of interpretation. He began to feel the pain well up in him as the session ended. In my closing on this, that sense of dread that the patient had, he was connected to losing a sense of vulnerability and physical vulnerability. All these things are occurring in our sessions these days. We're kind of learning as we're going in terms of structure. I call this section Many Rivers to Cross. The pandemic has heightened our consciousness to everyday gifts of minuscule elements of our life and journey we often take for granted. The pandemic reminds us, in an emotional sense, of a pre-verbal time when we were at the complete mercy of, at times, a cruel, negligent, and unpredictable, and even destructive environment. The story we're describing is ubiquitous, as Fairbairn suggests, as a universal happenstance. Then when we are at our most vulnerable, we are bound to be hurt, overly frustrated, and discombobulated. and at worst, tortured and abused. This is what this pandemic represents, a return to that place of complete vulnerability, having to rely on the caretaking of others, of our government, medical establishment, science, and industry to do their job and protect us from harm and disruption. We needn't look so far in the past to see Freud's valiant work as he faced anti-Semitism at its most virulent version in the Nazi era. Poverty, a world war, his cancer, while maintaining a thriving practice and originating a whole new science of the mind. We also must remember that Freud experienced the full brunt of the 1918 into 1920 Spanish flu epidemic that ravaged Europe with the tragic death of his beloved, then pregnant daughter, Sophie Abbess Freud, in 1920 due to complications from the influenza. Freud wrote to Pastor Pfister in January of 27, 2 days after Sophie's passing. This afternoon we received, he says, the news that our sweet Sophie in Hamburg had been snatched away from us by the influenza pneumonia, snatched away in the midst of her glowing health, from a full and active life as a competent mother and loving wife, all in 4 or 5 days, as though she never existed. Although we've been worried about her for a couple of days, we have nevertheless been hopeful. It is difficult to judge from a distance, he says. And this distance, he writes, must remain distance. We're not able to travel at once as we intended after these alarming news. There was no train, not even for an emergency. Does this sound familiar to us? Today, this is 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago. The undisguised brutality of our time weighs heavily upon us, he says. Tomorrow she is cremated, and our poor Sunday child. I work as much as I can. I am thankful for the diversion. The loss of a child seems to be a serious narcissistic injury, he writes. What is known as mourning will probably follow only later. We quickly recognize that Freud's letter could have been written at least last week, not 100 years ago. The distance must remain distance, he writes, which rings so true, as Freud confronted the same travel restrictions and the reality we're facing in our own communities, and by extension throughout the world. In reading this letter, we see that history often repeats. In fact, Freud taught us this. This pandemic has brought to us front and center the existential threat that comes with a sense of dread that often ignites the most primitive existential anxiety that is part and parcel of our own early childhood experience. The very fact that people participate in psychoanalytic psychotherapy tells us they have experienced one, if not many, existential threats at an earlier time that comes into our offices in the form of symptoms, dreams, and conflicts. Even for those not in therapy, they too feel the dread of this pandemic, the anxiety of having to change one's life in an unexpected and sometimes radical ways, which can also conjure long repressed anxiety and fear. We, as psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, are poised at the forefront of this calamity, not only ready to engage and provide a sense of holding for our patients through this crisis, but to use this moment to create a greater depth understanding of our individual and collective experience of being human. As psychotherapists, we recognize in this time of national crisis, it would be common for our own sense of to feel our own sense of vulnerability. We would be merged with a patient's vulnerability and could be induced strong countertransference anxiety, which I'll write about, which I've written about, and I will present at another time regarding a countertransference anxiety I had. Thus, it's especially important for the psychotherapist to be mindful of their own internal feelings when working on the front lines guarding against the ever-present contagion, I mean that, contagion of dread. When Winnicott spoke of annihilation anxiety as a fundamental truth of all humans, he also recognized simultaneously the unique ability in humans in their capacity to exert resilience and persistence in the face of all challenges and crises. In other words, despite the many rivers we must cross, humanity has a way of creatively engaging this ever-changing landscape to make, unlike Aldous Huxley's dystopian vision, a truly brave new world. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was helpful. My email is psyjack@msn.com if you feel like commenting through that. Otherwise, I'll be presenting another presentation on countertransference coming up. Thank you.